All right, so let me immediately introduce our next dear speaker. I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Gabriel Krivochen, Departmental Lecturer in Syntax in the Faculty of Linguistics, Philology, and Phonetics at the University of Oxford. He conducts research on properties of formal and natural languages from an interdisciplinary perspective. His work interrelates aspects of formal linguistics, mathematics, and physics. He's published articles and book chapters on topics of the syntax-semantics interface and the place of syntax among nonlinear dynamical systems. He has experience in interdisciplinary research, such as neurocognitive representations of syntactic categories, analysis of DNA strings, and biolinguistics. He is also the author of the theory of radical minimalism and has recently published important papers on workspaces and graphs. Mixing it up, computation in dynamical systems will be the title of his talk today. Dr. Krivochen, please.
Okay, thank you very much, just for the introduction, but also for inviting me. It's going to be hard to speak after Juan, but I'll try to do my best. There's a boatload of slides, so we'll get to wherever we get to. We're going to start by considering a distinction that I think is absolutely fundamental, which is the distinction between emulation and simulation in systems modeling. So it is commonplace at this point to say that descriptions of dynamical systems take the form of systems of differential equations, either partial differential equations or ordinary differential equations. These essentially track the changes in parameters in a dynamical system throughout time. Now, the question is, what are those equations actually doing? I think that in this respect, it's fundamental to keep in mind the distinction between emulation and simulation, the definition of which I quote from a manuscript by mathematician Peter Greenrod from Oxford too. So essentially, he says the emulation mission is to motivate and create algorithms that can recognize, interpret, learn, and express grammars and languages by performing the same activities that human brains can to at least the same standard. However, the simulation mission, he says, is to create algorithms that recognize, interpret, learn, and express grammars and languages by performing such activities in the same way that human brains perform them. That is, emulation has to do with comparability of outputs, whereas simulation has to do not only with comparability of outputs, but also the processes that deliver those outputs. Now, in this context, it is fundamental to bear in mind that the Turing test that is very popular nowadays, as was originally conceived by Turing, pertains to emulation and not simulation. Why do I say that? Well, Turing himself was aware of the distinction, and he poses the problem of whether we may describe what machines are doing as thinking, despite the processes behind the obtained outputs being very different from what a man does. Now, he doesn't address that objection, and he says this objection is a very strong one, but at least we can say that if nevertheless a machine can be constructed to play the imitation game satisfactorily, we need not be troubled by this objection. I think that in the context of Turing's paper, that is probably the best way to proceed, but I also contend that we should take that objection very seriously in the present context. Notice that Turing's idea of a machine was essentially a general purpose mechanism, but when we're talking about computation, we talk about both general purpose mechanisms, like a Turing machine, but also specific purpose mechanisms. Without going into exotic systems, a GPS is domain specific. It can only do one thing. Now, there is no, when we talk about this general purpose mechanism, what Turing had in mind is essentially any abstract machine that is capable of carrying out any set of instructions, predetermined instructions, in a specific format that can compute any well-defined function over reals. So essentially, when we talk about computation in Turing's sense, we talk about finite steps. We're talking about, in the case of classical computation, computation that holds. that delivers some sort of output, which we can evaluate in terms of simulation or emulation, and that follows a predetermined set of instructions. That's why the equivalence is usually taken to be a function is computable if it is calculable, if it is effectively calculable. Those are all synonymous in theoretical computer science. Now, what is the relation, or what is the nature of the relation between grammars and neurophysiological underpinnings, which is what we are trying to elucidate? And I guess we can ask that question in a slightly cheekier way by asking whether we're playing the Turing imitation game when we are characterizing language, whatever that is, by means of formal grammars. Now, notice that, as I said, Turing computability is sequential, it's function-based, and it's closed. So whatever information you are processing in a Turing machine, regardless of its power, needs to be encoded in a sequence of symbols. So essentially, you need to, for any well-formed formula, you need to apply what used to be called a Gödelization, which is essentially a function that assigns each symbol, be it categorimatic or syncategorimatic in a well-formed formula, an integer, and a unique natural number. So essentially, a formula, well-formed formula in any formal language, is expressed as a string of numbers, and then computations over formulae are effectively reduced to computations over numbers. Now, continuing the interactive trend started in the first talk, a cognitive computation is probably none of those things. It's probably not sequential, not function-based, and not closed. Now, this is not a new idea. There's a bunch of work by Goldin and Wegner that criticize the so-called physical church-Turing thesis, so the idea that any function that can be computed by a physical system can be computed by a Turing machine. They say it's fallacious in that the church-Turing thesis that essentially equates Turing computability with effective computability applies to, well, effective computation, not physical computation. Now, we'll see to what extent we need to worry about this. Now, if the church-Turing thesis is assumed to encompass all computation, which is usually done in the literature, then this entails that all computation needs to be function-based and algorithmic, because that is what Turing machines do. That is, we would be forced to reduce computability to computability of functions. The question is then, is what we do as fleshy beings, essentially sacks of meat with a lot of imagination, does it fall under computation in this definition? Well, probably not. Right? Is what we do effective computation of functions over naturals? Well, probably not. Now, what Goldin and Wegner insist on, and again, it was not a novel point in 2007, so it's even less novel in 2023, interactive computation is also computation. Now, that means that we need to redefine what computation is. In interactive computation, communication with other systems happens during the computation, not before or after it. So usually in classical computation, you have an input, you have a predetermined set of rules, you obtain your output, and only then can you feed that output to some other system. Now, in function-based computation, interactivity, that is which at least I'm going to understand as communication, bidirectional communication, presumably between a system and its environment, which may include other systems. Interactivity, I was saying, is banned by the very definition of a function, because effective computation has to do with closed systems. So think, for example, as a mental exercise, what would function-based homeostasis look like, right? So the process of self-regulation of an organism to maintain an internal balance in a changing environment, what would that look like under classical computation if the church-Turing thesis was the universal physical church-Turing thesis that some have proposed? Now, there are parallels within certain derivational grammatical architectures of essentially both of these things, right? So on the one hand, if the interfaces, let's say the performance systems can only read the outputs of syntax, as in classical generative theory, then we have a function-based system. The same is true of theories with parallel levels, which are linked by functions such as LFG. Now, invasive interfaces, so the idea that PF and LF could access the syntactic computation actively during the application of narrow syntactic operations, became a thing briefly, as far as I know, during the late 2000s, early 2010s. Berg's 2007 is an example, but perhaps more radically, Juan's Clash architecture and the implementation of multiple spellout within the Clash architecture is one of the strongest examples of this kind of interactivity. Now, at this point, we need to be careful, because when rejecting, or when, let's say, let's not be so bold, but when questioning the validity of the physical Church-Turing thesis to apply to, well, cognitive computation, we need to be careful in that physical computation can be misunderstood, because after all, our digital computers are built from physical materials, right? Physical materials support classical computation. So when we say physical to refer to something that has some sort of concrete support, maybe embodied computation would be better, but it has too many connotations. Embodied computation is a thing. It's a particular school of thought, and it does not quite represent what we're having in mind here. So it's just going to keep talking about physical computation, or occasionally biological computation. So this is something that Doug is going to talk about in more detail and with infinite expertise. So I'm just going to pretend that I know something about these things. This very nice paper by Gola and Breakspear from 2014 essentially distinguishes two main properties of nervous systems, at least well-functioning nervous systems. On the one hand, robustness, and on the other hand, adaptability. So we need robustness in any kind of nervous system, because we need synchronization across interacting regions. This is essentially what keeps the system from going completely bananas. Now, adaptability is also required in that if the environmental conditions change, the system has to somehow represent or map that environment. That is not exclusive of cognitive systems, right? If you have a heart exam and your heart's activity is way too regular, you're probably either dead or dying. So we do need adaptability in biological systems, because that makes it possible for the system to adapt to a changing environment. Now, in contrast to digital computers of the kind that Turing was defining, brains have plasticity. And this has to do, in principle, with two main properties of biological systems that I'm just going to summarize, which are degeneracy and multifunctionality. So degeneracy essentially has to do with the fact that a single outcome can come from a variety of processes, but also from a variety of components. And multifunctionality is kind of the other side of the coin, in that a single component may have more than a single function, right? So essentially, both degeneracy and multifunctionality throw out the window the idea that there is a one-to-one mapping between structure and function. Now, the characterization of the processes that may underpin the brain's adaptive behavior across scales of organization, so from the microscopic scale to the macroscopic scale, going from single neurons to neural assemblies to the whole brain, is still kind of elusive. But we can, presumably, a moment's reflection, as Chomsky likes to say, will reveal that, well, there are no compilers taking information across levels, right? We don't have compilers as in a classical computational architecture. And again, as Doug is going to mention, the role of information compression is crucial in living systems, in particular when mapping the environment. And that also has to do with the role of information in Juan's talk. Now, this is something that I've been hinting at, the as-if problem. So I don't think it's controversial to say that even though models of brain dynamics take the form of systems of PDEs, no one seriously believes that the brain is actively solving PDEs in real time. Right. Now, Binder and Ellis make an interesting point, which is, again, sort of relativizing the physical Church-Turing thesis. Physical laws are not computer algorithms for a number of reasons. One is, a physical law is not simply the execution of an algorithm, but also multiple algorithms can solve dynamics of a single physical system, such as a two-body problem, for example. Now, we would like to propose, again, following Binder and Ellis, that the same applies to brains. So modeling of brain activity involves a good amount of as-if thinking, by which I mean that a system S behaves as if it was doing X, so X is a good approximation of whatever is going on. Right. And now that is precisely what emulation does, approximating outputs. Modeling is, to a great extent, this kind of process. Now, when we talk about computation in dynamical systems, we can understand the physical Church-Turing thesis in terms of either simulation or emulation. Now, the emulation interpretation is essentially nothing is done in nature. No natural process across levels of organizations is such that a Turing machine cannot describe it. The simulation interpretation is that everything that nature does can be carried out step by step by a Turing machine. Right. Similarly, when talking about the relation between grammars and neurophysiological correlates or underpinnings, the physical Church-Turing thesis can be interpreted in these two ways, right? As emulation, namely, grammars are approximations of descriptions of stable states. So if we have a vision of cognitive systems as complex dynamical systems, a grammar is simply a description of a snapshot, right? Essentially a Poincare map. The simulation interpretation of the relation between grammars and neurophysiological underpinnings is that literally grammars are descriptions of physical observables. And that is what you have in a good portion of the literature, for example, trying to map oscillation frequencies to phase and non-phase heads. Now, leaving all linguistic issues aside, the question that we need to ask, I think, is whether such a perspective is telling us anything about either grammars or neurocognition. Right? Do we learn anything about either syntax or neurocognition by establishing a one-to-one correspondence between observables and grammars? I personally think we don't. Now, looking at grammars in terms of descriptions of stable states allow us to retain what I think are the most interesting parts of formal systems, which is discreteness both in categories and in operations. And this discreteness is crucial both in procedural models, so there is derivational systems, and in declarative models such as GPSG, HPSG, LFG, and so on and so forth. Now, recognizing that there may be a divorce between what grammars are looking at and what brain dynamics are doing entails abandoning the idea that necessarily a theory of grammar is a theory of human knowledge of language. Again, this is not an original idea in that both Paul Postal and Putnam and Chavez express a very similar sentiment. What I'm saying is that it is misguided to ask of grammars in the way we classically understand them to emulate cognition, as much as it is misguided to ask of neuroscience to provide characterizations of expressions and relations in natural language sentences, right? The characterization of what computation is in grammars on the one hand and in neurocognition in the other hand is radically different. In this respect, I would like to emphasize the idea that what Juan was talking about and what Doug is going to talk about has to do with finding core properties which apply to both kinds of systems. For example, dynamical frustration. The idea that there may be a dynamical frustration, and I say may not because I don't agree, but because I want to be cautious, a dynamical frustration at the core of natural language syntax as an empirical discipline, and neurocognition as a part of biology, does not entail reducing one to the other. It entails saying they are the same kind of system, but not they have the same primitives or operate over the same kinds of entities. So what I'm arguing against, I suppose, is a form of strong reductionism, because strong reductionism leaves us with no theory of syntax to speak of. And if our definition of computation, we want to apply the same definition of computation to both cases, then either computation is going to be too vague to say anything interesting, or it's going to be too narrow to be empirically fruitful. Now, what is the positive side? I'm just going to try to kind of fly through this because I do imagine I do not have a lot of time. This is what I've called mixed computation. And in order to introduce mixed computation, so we have a 5 minutes warning. Thank you very much.
I imagine you don't have enough time. I'm here to tell you that no, we've got like 5 minutes only.
Yeah, okay.
So, yeah, okay.
So let's just take a look at the Feigenbaum bifurcation diagram, right? This is essentially a model of population growth where X is a ratio of existing population to maximum possible population, and R is a parameter that we can tweak as we want. And we see that chaotic behavior emerges from this very simple recurrence relation as R approaches 3.56. Now, the question is, what kind of formal system can characterize the behavior of this dynamical system? Well, it has been pointed out in the literature that not a single system can do everything. So certain values of R, a finite state machine can do wonders. For other values of R, context-free is fine. Now, when for the onset of chaos, the exact kind of computational system that can deliver the goods is unclear, but it should be at least context sensitive. Now, the lesson for syntacticians and ordinary working grammarians, among which I count myself, is that structural uniformity misses important dynamics. If we wanted to describe the behavior of the Feigenbaum bifurcation diagram by means of a single formal system, we would be missing a lot, either because we're undershooting or because we're overshooting. Now, I do suppose that I need to just wrap up. So there's a whole bunch of things about tree-adjoining grammars that unfortunately, unfortunately for me, because I love talking about tree-adjoining grammars, we're not going to talk about. But the idea is that we're not saying that by giving up structural uniformity in syntax and allowing for several kinds of computational models to be applied to natural language sentence analysis, suddenly we're going to be able to establish a one-to-one correspondence with dynamical systems as applied to neurobiology. The operations are different, the primitives are different, the data is different, the analytic methods are different, so they are different things. However, I do think that we can take a hint from the study of complex nonlinear dynamical systems and essentially stop trying to fit a Calabi-Yau peg into a round hole. And essentially what this takes us is that mixed computation, in the sense of a structural description, combines finite state, context-free, mildly context-sensitive dependencies in local derivational cycles, is also emulation. This is also emulation. However, it is a better emulation tool than structural uniformity. And for the study of complex dynamical systems, this is essentially a truism. Now, it takes us closer to bridging the gap, but it is not bridging the gap itself. What we're saying is that computations between brains and grammars, and I'm being deliberately sloppy here, may be characterized by comparable underlying properties, which I think, again, is what Juan was hinting at. Or, well, not hinting at, he was pretty damn explicit about it. These underlying properties are multi-stability, so the presence of multiple metastable states, local minima, dynamical frustration, which he talked about, and degeneracy, which I mentioned a bit before. These properties hold, so far as we know, across levels of organization in biological dynamical systems. Now, while not psycholinguistic in nature, my personal proposal about how syntactic analysis could be conducted, mixed computation does seem to satisfy what Carl Pollard called psycholinguistic responsibility. Don't ask your formal model to do something that you wouldn't ask your brain to do. And I think it raises the bet because, in addition to this psycholinguistic responsibility, there are some empirical advantages of mixed computation that we'll have to leave for another day. So with this, I say thank you for your attention.
Wow, what a talk. I'll remain quiet. I invite Dr. Daimagadam, Juan, Douglas, and others to join the discussion.
This is cool.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Do you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, sir. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I try to activate my webcam, but I can't apparently because there are 4 people in the room, and maybe now it worked. Now, I enjoyed very much this very interesting presentation and also discussions. I think it attracted my attention from several perspectives. One thing maybe I should share with you is that when I was browsing through the handbook of biolinguistics, I came across this quotation in page 53 of that handbook. The title is Structure and Function, the title of that section. And it says, I quote, "In this handbook, structure and function are regarded as identical. Or to be more exact, all structure is regarded as function. That is, I quote again, all objects are events," end of quotation. In this handbook, the explanation of linguistic phenomena will be sought as far as possible in physical laws. This is page 53 of the Handbook of Biolinguistics. Now, on the notions of structure and function, I wanted to share this quotation from the 1950 handbook. From the talk, I realized that the term function is used in in several senses. When you were talking about that is, function is used in a broad sense, I guess sometimes it is used in the sense of communicative function, but also you hinted at LFG, and when we have function in LFG, then we are talking about grammatical functions, a different kind of function. So maybe we should make clear what we mean by function. One thing. Second thing is that I think part of the talk was, in fact, paying attention to a very important question which attracted the attention of generative linguists in the 60s, and then in the 70s, it was left aside, and that was the question of the psychological reality. That is psychological reality in the sense that the grammar, the entities of the grammar are not necessarily comparable with the entities of the brain, or the computations in grammar and the computation in brain do not necessarily match. So that brings us also to the question of what is reality? What is psychological reality? I think Chomsky, after the 1963 paper, in fact, changed his mind and said, well, from now on, for me, reality of a model is that when it works, when it makes the right predictions. So just like pure sciences. So maybe we can talk about what is the status of psychological reality and how you evaluate psychological reality within your mixed computational model. It was interesting for me when you talked about, you warned us, you warned the listeners about sticking too much to reductionism and trying to boil down everything to a few things. That was interesting, and I think what I'm talking about in terms of interactional model of language also avoids strong reductionism. Thank you very much for your very nice, very thoughtful discussion.
So thank you very much for the comments. I should make a clarification. When I was talking about functions in the sense of the Church-Turing thesis, I was referring to algorithms. So essentially a set of well-defined mechanical procedures that map inputs to outputs. And when talking about the relation, the absence of a one-to-one relation between structure and function in the context of the discussion of degeneracy and multifunctionality in the theory of biological systems, I was referring to a different notion of function, which is evidently not a mapping from an input to an output, or if you have a multivalued function, several outputs, but to whatever role a particular system or subsystem in a complex biological organism may play. Doug, I think, is going to mention some cases where the divorce between, let's say, the hardware and the software is radically disrupted. For example, in cases of removal of part of the brain, where the functions are not affected in a linear way, right? If you get half of your brain removed, you don't lose half of everything you do. So those two things, I think, should be kept apart. I think the other comment pertained to
reductionism, I think.
Yeah. Yes. I think that is pretty much the leitmotif of any serious biolinguistics any serious biolinguistics inquiry, in that the point of biolinguistics is not, I think, to do biology, otherwise it would be just called biology. There has to be a part for language, there has to be a part for natural language syntax. After all, generative grammar is still grammar. What I'm saying is we should embrace the fact that the primitives and the operations assumed in the analysis of biological systems as nonlinear dynamical systems and of grammars as approximations to snapshots of that dynamical system, right, as descriptions of stable or metastable states of that dynamical system. I think those should be kept apart in the sense that neither should be expressed necessarily in terms of the other. So there is no way that makes sense to me in which we can map the distinction between WH clefs and IT clefs to biological properties. And I don't think anybody has ever seriously proposed that. However, when we have in part of the literature the idea that brain oscillations correspond one-to-one with aspects of phrase structure, in particular with the distinction between phase heads and non-phase heads, I do think that there is a danger that has to be pointed out. And that danger is that if we keep doing that, we may be left with no theory of natural language syntax to speak of in the context of biolinguistics, which would be a shame. So the kind of research that Juan talked about and that Doug is going to talk about, I think represent an idea of what biolinguistics is, which embraces the fact that we need grammars to describe expressions and relations, and at the same time we need a vocabulary to talk about interactions and oscillations and brain dynamics and physical systems, and that they do not have to be about the same thing.
All right, thank you very much. I have both good and bad news. The good news is that we have expanded the time. The bad news is we have reduced the break time. So, it's a lose-lose, I guess, but it's a win-win if you think about it. There's this question from the comment section. CTT works in number theoretic functions. We're hardly able to expand it to all functions, including real numbers. Yep. It is even harder to apply it to the physical domain. Do you agree with this statement, Diego?
Yeah, I do. And as a matter of fact, Turing himself was aware of this. So notice that if you take Turing's characterization of what he was doing in the 1936 paper, he explicitly says that he's going to talk about autonomous machines without external operators, so there's no agency, probably not good for biological systems. And at the same time, if you're only dealing with real numbers, many formalizations of wave functions are out because you are going to have functions of the type e to the I kx or something for k, a wave number. So there's a whole bunch of things which are left out. However, it doesn't mean that the physical Church-Turing thesis was not pursued. As a matter of fact, there's a paper from 2006, I think, by Hartmut Fitz, which is called Church Thesis and Physical Computation. And if you look at the so-called mathematical universe hypothesis, so Max Tegmark's sort of cosmological idea that the physical reality is a mathematical structure based on the fact that the standard model is essentially just a collection of numbers, then the appeal of trying to see the Church-Turing thesis as a model for universal computation, well, is real. That's why we need to take it seriously and not, we can't dismiss it just because it doesn't really make sense for our object of study. We need to, I think, be able to talk to those people and sort of bring them to either interactive computation or a redefinition of the notion of the Church-Turing thesis that acknowledges the limitations to effective computation in the computer science sense of effective computability.
Very well. Thank you very much for the comprehensive answer. And yeah, I kind of feel that Juan wants to say something.
No, I just want to look. I have a million things, but I can also tell them over email. My question is, how are we doing? I don't want to take over other speakers' time. So depending on that, we may leave it at this, or we can go on. I don't have a sense of that.
I'm hoping that we'll be able to return to some of these issues in my final session. So we have an hour devoted to me, and I do not intend to talk at you for an hour.
Okay.
Although I could, but there were general protests. So I think there will be space to return to some of these topics if we're worried about keeping time. There's a lot to talk about. And I encourage people in the audience to, speak up. If you're struggling to understand some of the ideas that we're bandying about here, that's totally fine. We're happy to try and explain ourselves better, which can only improve our science.
Yeah, they're going to attack you, Douglas, because you have the most time, like an hour. But I believe you guys can talk later, over email or stuff. But let's just keep to the schedule of the event. And thank you. Until then.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Oh, thank you. That was great.